Hello, this is another video comparing an OEM genuine Spyderco to a Chinese clone. These two knives are Hungarians. Let's see. C173s, Hungarian plain blades. Here's the two boxes. They're very similar. A little bit of difference. I'm not going to go over a lot on the boxes other than to say this is a little bit unusual. Sometimes the low-end Spydercos will come in a strange flat box that isn't made like a typical Spyderco box. These boxes are made like Spyderco boxes, but the clone unusually does not have a label on it. So usually they're very good at counterfeiting these labels and get very few things wrong, but these don't have labels. Insides are a little different too. So here's the genuine Hungarian. Comes like a lot of Spydercos you see. It's in this kind of fitted bubble wrap. It's very high quality bubble wrap. It's got you know, the little thing that tells you about Hungarians on the inside. It's got the typical, if you watch any of my other videos, it's got the space here where you can see the bottom white of the box. The foam doesn't fit right, just like all the rest of the Spydercos. So there's the knife. So here is how the clone came, which sometimes they do this. The clone is in this really cheap flat wrap, and sometimes Spyderco sends their knives in this flat wrap too, but it's not all crinkly and cheap like this. I think we're caught. Poked a hole. Oh, now come on. It's in the flat crinkle wrap, and then it's in this fitted foam, which I don't believe I've ever seen a Spyderco that was come like this. But not to say they don't, but I've never seen that. So here's the two knives. You can tell right off the bat. One of the reasons why I make these videos is so that people will, if you look at an eBay auction for a knife, and you can get the seller to send you, some kind of exact, actual photographs of the knife he's selling, is so that you can pick out a clone. And right off the bat, you can see that this is fairly easy. Is that the G10 on the clone, they didn't bother polishing it, excuse me, like the Real Spyderco, which is strange because they seem to get everything pretty well on these knives, but they totally missed the boat on that. And they did this on the Valaton that I had too. It had a similar satiny finish. Not that there's anything particularly wrong with that other than the finish that they put on these G10s. It really makes them look really nice. So if you're looking for, this is a gentleman's kind of folder because of just the way it's kind of laid out. It's not a heavy utility use knife that. It's not such a bad thing to put the polish on the G10. It doesn't help that this is satin either. So you don't gain anything in traction, and it obviously jumps out as a clone to you. There's also a difference in size, and I'll go over all these things pretty quick. Right off the bat, though, I can tell you that if you pick up either one of these knives and you open and close it and you work the knife, that the clone is a superbly made knife. It is just in its own right, it is a very nice knife, and there's nothing to complain about. It feels exactly like the Spyderco, all the functionality on the knife. It is smooth as silk. Everything is centered. The metal is finished nice. It is just a really, really, really nice knife. Of course, like I said before, you have no idea what the metallurgy of this steel is, but my experience with the clones is they come with good steel on them. So for the most part, except for the really low-end $3.95 ones like the H1 salts, the little salt dragonflies, those were absolutely terrible. So I'm not going to go over a lot on this particular knife other than to show any kind of differences, contrasts in it, between the two knives. But the blades on them are very similar, how they're ground and the finish. This is the real one, obviously, and edge is cut nice. It is a nicely done knife. Here is the clone. A lot of sparkles here. I hope none of these show up on the screen. Usually they can't quite, I'm getting a lot of sparkling. Usually they can't quite get the etching and everything perfect on these things. You can see the Spyderco on the clone here on the right. It's not as, the spider is not as dark and doesn't jump out at you. That's almost always the case. It kind of goes to a light gray as you turn it. It's not bad in person, but when you start putting it up to here, also the the texturing and the kind of detail that's in the spider itself is usually not evidenced on the clones. It's pretty much flat. Same thing with the logo of the maker here. You can see it's just not as fully etched, and you can see there's a little difference in the font on the Taiwan Tai Ching. It's just a little different. The problem is that if you got this in your hand and you're not seeing the other one, I usually try to point out things that will jump out at you. Usually if you kind of look at and turn the logos, you'll say, Spyderco is that spider is just a little bit grayish looking, and it doesn't have that pop. And that's usually the case with the clones for the most part. Both of the Real Spyderco is extremely sharp, and so is the clone. I would say that the blades feel identical to them, as do the actions on the knives. The other thing is, I don't know if you can appreciate here, is these knives feel greatly different in your hand. The clone is bigger, and if you look across especially this narrow area right here, you can see that the clone is bigger. Same thing with the bottom. If you look at this area right here on the tail of the knife, the clone is a bigger knife. The clips are very similar, but it's just, especially when you put it in your hand, this clone feels like you have more knife in your hand. I will say this, that from a usability standpoint, the Spyderco feels very fine, almost delicate, because of how smooth and polished it is and how it fits to your hand, the way it's made to sit in your hand. It's a very svelte, elegant feeling knife in your hand. And because it's so polished and smooth and slippery, that I think there's an advantage to the clone being a little bigger and thicker. It's a little bit thicker this way, and it's wider in all dimensions this way. It gives you something, at least in my hand, a little more something substantial to hold on to. So really this inspires more confidence in using it to cut something, because you're holding on to more. If you had a smaller hand, you may not, that may not be a big thing to you, but this thing is really small, comparatively speaking, and slippery, and you've got a nice bolster here to hold on to and lock your fingers on, but no jimping to stop you from sliding forward. I think you can use this because you're stopped pretty well here, but it's a slippery, small, little elegant thing. It feels finer in your hand than the clone, which is a little clunkier and a little more substantial in your hand. I could say that, if you don't want to spend the cash to get this guy here, this guy right here masquerades pretty darn well, especially if you decide to take these scales off and polish them up and stick them back on there. Then you'd have one doggone hard time telling the difference. You can see the logos there. And it shows up more on camera than it does in real person. Well, no, I guess it's sort of grayish looking in real life too. But you can see there especially that spider is just not etched near as well on the clone. The clips on these things are pretty much identical. So the clone is on the bottom here. Sometimes they do a tremendously bad job on the clips. Well, hold it. This is one of the ones. Yeah, okay. They're not identical. I'm sorry. I was thinking of maybe of another knife. They're close. They're not as bad as on some of the other knives, but make sure I got a focus here. So if you look at the clone on the bottom, you can see how thin that metal is. That edge right there, that would be one way you could probably tell in a photograph if you took a screen grab of this right here, is that you can see that on the real one it is a substantially thick piece of steel, and it is almost like a sheet that they bent of stainless on the bottom on the clone. That is pretty good telltale there. There's also some difference in the standoffs. The standoffs on the clone are just kind of hourglass shaped, where they're kind of routed, and there've definitely been some sculpting done in the standoffs on the Real Deal here. Fit and finish of the knife. You know, there's some very, very, very small differences that you could go over, some seams and stuff, but not enough to make it super apparent and not enough to really affect the quality of the knife too much. The blades are about the same thickness, and the profiles are pretty much the same on the blades. You get the clone on the top here. You know, if you looked at that right there, you'd say really the clone was, the flat grind on the clone is not as much graininess to it. It's you know, they grind it with a little finer grit. I would say right here, you know, you might give it to the clone as far as cosmetics. Both of these knives suffer from a problem that's been documented in a couple of other reviews of this Hungarian, which is, you know, to keep the profile of the knife. This is a common thing they've done on a couple of their knives. They did it on the Gale Bradley and some other knives. They want to keep this, they don't want to make a cutout for your finger to get in there much. So to keep that profile of the knife as being like this was originally a slip lock, you know, the ethnic version, the Real Deal version of this you might get in Eastern Europe. What they did is they have very little cutout here to work your fingers in, so that if you're trying to do this to get if you're trying to just use the pad of your finger to unlock, it's darn near impossible. It's got a little cutout on this one liner. The best way I do it is to take my nail, which I usually leave my nails a little bit long, is to kind of hook it in there and get it. And it's the same on either knife, trying to actuate the unlocking of these knives. Maybe a little easier. Yeah, actually it's a little bit, the lock moves a little easier on the clone. So I would interpret that as the steel is not quite as stiff. It's pretty darn stiff. Seems a stronger spring on the Real Deal. You got to really get in there and tear your nail up. Now my nail's all shredded. So I would say that both of them have an identical kind of issue right there. The cutouts for the fingers there's maybe a slight difference. It's not quite as well done on the clone, but not enough so you could really tell it by looking at it. This is the real one. Here's a close-up of the standoff. And let me see if I can get both of these side by side real close. In a picture, you could tell by looking at the standoffs. So I would say the three things you look for in a picture is you look for this is the clone, you'd look for the thickness of the steel on the clip. You'd look for the standoffs, whether they're this routed out, sculptured instead of just a plain hourglass. And then you'd look for the scales. And then you could also try and see in a picture, you know, how well does that spider show up? Because people are selling, you know, all these knives are being sold as clones on eBay, and people are passing them off and making a lot of money. So here you go. So you say, I don't know what this knife exactly, but, you know, 175 bucks or something versus $16. And I'm going to tell you that if you're looking at a value proposition and you're not, you know, going to say protect our copyrights, if you're not bringing those arguments and everything in this, if you're just saying value proposition, you know, it's hard to argue that this is not, you know, I mean, it's a ripoff of their intellectual property and whatever, but this is a great knife in your hand. And I guarantee you that if I took the scale up and polished it up and made it mirrored and gave this knife to you, the average person who wasn't a Spyderco expert never, ever, ever going to be able to tell the difference. Now the question is, over the long run, of course, the steel, and what's it going to do? Is it going to rust? Is it going to be prone to corrosion? Is it going to be soft and everything? I can tell you that the Chinese are putting pretty good steel on their knives. And certainly they're using steel on most of their knives that's exquisite steel, even up until the last year or two recently. So, they use a lot of 8CR13 MOV. They use a lot of 420 steel. They use a lot of D2. So those are the things that they can get in supply pretty easily. So, as far as S30V and, CTS and those kind of things, no, they can't get that stuff. And they may put it on the knife like CTS XHP, but they can't get that. So, there's no doubt that the clone is not made out of that steel here. But I just have not seen one that was made out of bad stuff and didn't act right. And if you go to cut things, they seem to retain an edge real well, and they come with nice edges on them. So pretty much, if you're spending about $16 or more on the clones, in my experience, you get a pretty good knife. As far as handling the knife and everything, I'm not going to go into the philosophy of stealing intellectual property and copyright. That's a whole other ball game, and I don't think anybody can argue that they're not breaking laws and doing bad things over there. I get these things to basically compare them against the real knives, so that people can pick out the real knife in a eBay advertisement or a YouTube thing, so they don't get ripped off. That's why I do these things. But this is my knife. I'm keeping it. This knife will move on to somebody else, and give it away to somebody. Because I don't keep clones. I just don't. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them. This video is shot in 4K, so if you have a 4K video card and a 4K monitor, this should look pretty crisp to you. Hopefully everything came out fine on it. Thank you for watching, and feel free to leave any comments.